What happens when a convicted murderer becomes a celebrated author? Today, I kick off the A to Z of Murderers, a series where we delve into the lives of infamous individuals whose stories continue to captivate and disturb us. Many of you may be familiar with Netflix's The Staircase, which explores the case of author Michael Peterson and the mysterious death of his wife. But today, I'm taking you further back in time to examine a man I've titled the original author killer, Jack Henry Abbott. True crime often brings us tales of criminals whose actions shock us. But what about those who wield both a pen and a knife? When I've come across author killers before, I've often felt they rewrite the script of their own crimes, completely removing themselves from any guilt. Out of curiosity, and for this video, I attempted to read some of Abbott's publications, but didn't get very far. Take this quote for instance. "Sometimes, I doubt that anyone with a philosophical turn of mind is fit to judge anyone. He never comprehends the concept of guilt." This very much felt like Abbott had crafted a philosophical smokescreen, using philosophy to obscure his moral responsibility, turning his crime into an abstract debate rather than an act with real consequences. Of course, this could be entirely unrelated and full of bias, since I couldn't help but roll my eyes into another dimension during my research. But regardless, Jack Henry Abbott's life is a tale of talent entangled with violence, a journey from the confines of prison to the literary limelight and back again. So let's dive into the story of Jack Abbott, a man whose intellect was as sharp as his crimes were brutal. How did he go from the shadows of a prison cell to the spotlight of fame? Jack Henry Abbott's crimes were impulsive and brutal, each rooted in sudden, violent confrontations. Twice, he ended lives in the heat of a brawl using a knife to fatally stab his opponents. The only time they appear human is when you have a knife at their throats. The instant you remove it, they fall back into animality, obscenity. A quote in a book by Jack: "I don't think that's what people are hoping for when they say put your money where your mouth is, fella." Beneath these acts of violence lay a deeply troubled psyche. Abbott exhibited clear antisocial traits and was described by psychologist Robert D. Hare as a likely psychopath. He was impulsive, manipulative, and utterly devoid of empathy. Abbott refused to accept responsibility, often framing his actions as the result of a system that had failed him. He drank heavily, committed crimes compulsively, and believed he was justified in his actions, even demanding an apology of some sort from society. This is what I was talking about with the eye rolling. This man was infuriating. Paranoia gripped him. He saw enemies everywhere, from prison guards to society at large, convinced they were all out to get him. Abbott's story is one of violence, psychological complexity, and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. Jack Henry Abbott, born on January 21, 1944, at Camp Skill in Oscoda, Michigan, began life under turbulent circumstances. The son of an Irish-American soldier and a Chinese-American woman, Abbott's childhood was marred by instability. His mother, alleged to be a sex worker, and his father's military commitments left Abbott bouncing between foster homes from an early age. By the age of 9, behavioral problems brought him into conflict with teachers and the law. He described himself as a state-raised convict, spending much of his youth in juvenile detention facilities. At age 12, he was sent to a school for delinquent boys, where confinement with other violent offenders shaped his worldview. Abbott believed every encounter to be a potential threat, a mindset forged through years of mistreatment by those meant to rehabilitate him. At 16, Abbott's struggles escalated when he was sent to the Utah State Industrial School for Boys, a long-term reform institution. There he endured repeated abuse by guards, trauma that he later claimed left him permanently maladjusted. His education ended at 6th grade. and his transition to adulthood was marked not by freedom, but by deeper entrenchment in the criminal justice system. Despite this troubled upbringing, Abbott would later rise to literary acclaim, his story intertwining talent, violence, and tragedy. Jack Abbott's life behind bars began early and was marked by escalating violence and rebellion. In 1963, at just 19 years old, Abbott was convicted of forging stolen checks after breaking into a shoe store. This crime landed him in the Utah State Penitentiary for a maximum sentence of 5 years. While serving this sentence, Abbott's defiance of authority and violent tendencies became clear. In 1965, at the age of 21, he fatally stabbed a fellow inmate during a brawl. Convicted of manslaughter, Abbott was sentenced to an additional 3 to 20 years in prison. His behavior continued to deteriorate, earning him a reputation as a troublemaker who regularly defied guards and frequently found himself in solitary confinement. By 1971, Abbott's imprisonment took another dark turn. Seizing an opportunity, he escaped from custody and fled to Colorado. There, he committed an armed robbery at a savings and loan association in Denver. His freedom was short-lived. Abbott was apprehended just 6 weeks later and sentenced to 19 years in federal prison for armed robbery. This time he was sent to the notorious United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, where his rebellious behavior kept him confined to solitary for years. It was during this period of isolation that Abbott began to write. In 1977, he learned that acclaimed author Norman Mailer was working on a book about another notorious criminal, Gary Gilmore, a convicted murderer who gained fame for his insistence on the swift execution of his death sentence. Abbott, believing he could offer a more authentic perspective on life behind bars, reached out to Mailer claiming that Gilmore's accounts were exaggerated. Because yes, of course, everybody experiences the same experiences in exactly the same way, right, Jack? Mailer, intrigued by Abbott's eloquence and raw insight, encouraged him to put his experiences into words. Over time, their correspondence evolved into a collection of letters that would later be published as In the Belly of the Beast, a harrowing exposé of the brutality and dehumanization within the American prison system. The publication of Abbott's book in 1981 brought him widespread literary acclaim. Critics praised the work as a powerful and disturbing account of life in confinement, and Mailer championed Abbott as a writer of rare talent. Fueled by this recognition, Mailer actively supported Abbott's bid for parole, despite warnings from prison officials about Abbott's mental state and lack of rehabilitation. In June 1981, Abbott's parole was granted, and he was released to a halfway house in New York City. There, he briefly became a literary sensation, mingling with Mailer's circle of influential writers and intellectuals. He appeared on national television programs like Good Morning America and attended glittering literary gatherings where he was lauded as a voice of raw authenticity. However, the cracks in Abbott's carefully curated public image began to show almost immediately. Many criticized Mailer for advocating for Abbott's release, accusing him of being so enamored by Abbott's talent that he ignored his violent history and propensity for danger. Even Mailer later expressed regret for his involvement, calling it another episode in my life which I can find nothing to cheer about or nothing to take pride in. Very grim. Abbott's story seemed eerily parallel to that of Gary Gilmore. Both men were sociopaths with undeniable talent, Abbott as a writer, Gilmore as an artist. Each spent most of their lives in prison, committed violent crimes soon after gaining a taste of freedom, and left behind legacies marked by tragedy and controversy. Ironically, the two even crossed paths in prison, their lives intertwined in ways that Mailer likely never anticipated. Abbott's moment of literary fame was as fleeting as his freedom. Less than 6 weeks after his release, his violent tendencies resurfaced, leading to a tragic and irreversible act that would seal his fate. In the early hours of July 18th, 1981, Jack Henry Abbott's fleeting taste of freedom ended in tragedy. Just 6 weeks after his release from prison, Abbott found himself at the Binnibon Cafe in Manhattan's East Village, dining with two women. The Binnibon, located at 79 2nd Avenue, was a modest establishment frequented by artists and intellectuals. That night, a seemingly trivial disagreement turned deadly. At around 5 a.m., Abbott rose from his table and asked the 22-year-old waiter, Richard Adan, where the restroom was located. Adan, an aspiring playwright and actor, explained that the restroom was accessible only through the kitchen and reserved for employees due to insurance restrictions. This policy did not sit well with Abbott, whose temper flared. The disagreement escalated quickly, and the two men took their argument outside. Near a dumpster on 5th Street, Abbott produced a knife and stabbed Adan in the chest, nearly severing his heart. Adan collapsed, bleeding out on the pavement, while Abbott walked away into the night, leaving his companions stunned. Something tells me the psychologist was on the money, calling old Jackie Boy a likely psychopath. The tragic irony of this event was not lost on the artistic community. While Abbott's literary talent had brought him acclaim, Adan's creative promise was just beginning to blossom. His first play had recently been accepted for production by the renowned LA Mama Experimental Theatre Club, and he was poised to make a mark as a playwright. Adding to the surreal nature of the crime, the very next day, the New York Times published a glowing review of Abbott's book In the Belly of the Beast. A reviewer called the work awesome, brilliant, perversely ingenious. Meanwhile, police were launching a citywide manhunt for Abbott, now wanted for murder. For 2 months, Abbott evaded capture. Fleeing Manhattan, he moved through several states using forged documents and adopting the alias Jack Eastman. His journey took him to Texas, Mexico, and back to the US, where he lived in flop houses and worked temporary jobs, including as a roughneck in an oil field. On September 23, 1981, Abbott's run ended in Morgan City, Louisiana. Recognized by a local business owner, he was detained and handed over to authorities without resistance. The fallout from the murder was widespread. Abbott's supporters, including Norman Mailer, who had advocated for his release, faced intense public criticism. Mailer admitted regret, later describing his involvement as nothing to take pride in. Abbott's book royalties were frozen, and Richard Adan's widow successfully sued him for $7.5 million in damages, ensuring she received all future earnings from the book. Adan's death was a devastating loss for the artistic community. He had recently gained recognition for his talent as a playwright, with his first work accepted for production. Abbott's post-trial years were marked by controversy, failed literary ventures, and continued struggles with prison life. In 2001, Abbott appeared before a parole board which denied his release, citing his lack of remorse. His story remains a haunting reminder of the thin line between redemption and recidivism, and the tragic cost borne by an innocent victim with a bright future ahead. Abbott's trial for the murder of Richard Adan began in January 1982. Despite having the support of notable figures such as Ryder Kaczynski, Abbott represented himself in court, portraying his actions as self-defense. He claimed that Adan had provoked the altercation and suggested that he believed Adan had a weapon, a claim unsupported by evidence. The prosecution countered with excerpts from Abbott's book showcasing his chilling descriptions of violence. When asked about a particularly graphic passage, Abbott's response was telling. "It's good, isn't it?" On January 22, 1982, a jury convicted Abbott of first-degree manslaughter. In April of that year, he was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The presiding judge remarked that Abbott's case was an indictment of a prison system that brutalizes rather than rehabilitates. The fallout from Abbott's crime extended far beyond the courtroom. As I mentioned earlier, Richard Adan's widow, Ricky Adan, filed a $10 million wrongful death lawsuit against Abbott. In 1990, she was awarded $7.5 million in damages, including all royalties from In the Belly of the Beast. The book that had brought Abbott fame now became a financial lifeline for the family of his victim. The literary elite who had championed Abbott, most notably Norman Mailer, faced widespread criticism. Many accused them of prioritizing Abbott's literary talent over the safety of the public. As we know, Abbott's former champion Mailer himself later admitted something like this. In 1987, Jack Abbott released My Return, a follow-up to his earlier work, In the Belly of the Beast. Unlike its predecessor, this book failed to resonate with readers or critics. Laden with self-pity, My Return offered no remorse for his actions. Instead, Abbott placed blame on the prison system and society, demanding an apology for the hardships he had endured rather than taking responsibility for his crimes. Abbott's behavior and outlook did not improve with time. In 2001, he faced the parole board but was denied release. The decision cited his persistent lack of remorse, a history of serious disciplinary issues while incarcerated, and his extensive criminal record. On February 10, 2002, Abbott's life reached its final chapter. He was found in his prison cell, having used bed sheets and shoelaces to fashion a makeshift noose. His death was ruled having unalived himself. A note was left behind, but its contents have never been publicly disclosed, leaving the final thoughts of Jack Abbott shrouded in mystery. Abbott's story remains one of squandered potential, a man of undeniable literary talent whose unwillingness to confront his own actions led to his ultimate downfall. Jack Abbott often portrayed himself as the victim of an unforgiving system. He claimed his early incarceration from ages 12 to 18 stemmed from his inability to adapt to foster homes. At 18, he received an indeterminate sentence of up to 5 years for writing a bad check, which he cited as evidence of a system that disproportionately punishes those deemed socially unfit. In both In the Belly of the Beast and My Return, Abbott presented his view of a deeply flawed prison system. He argued that prisoners are stripped of their humanity and subjected to unaccountable power structures. In the Belly of the Beast, he described the crushing helplessness prisoners experience and warned of the broader societal repercussions of such a system. We have no legal rights as prisoners, only as citizens. The only rights we have are those left to their discretion. So, we assert our rights the only way we can. It is a compromise, and in the end, I greatly fear we as prisoners will lose, but the loss will be society's loss. We are only a few steps removed from society. After us, come you. However, Abbott's words contrasted starkly with his actions and attitude. Psychologist Robert D. Hare identified him as exhibiting traits consistent with psychopathy, including a lack of empathy and remorse. In an interview for A Current Affair, Abbott dismissed accountability for Richard Adan's death, stating, "Remorse implies you did something wrong. If I'm the one who stabbed him, it was an accident." Okay, Jack. Abbott's behavior in court further solidified this perception. He repeatedly insulted Adan's widow, claimed his victim had no future as an actor, and minimized the violence of his actions, describing the fatal stabbing as a clean wound and asserting there was no pain. Despite his insistence that he had been unfairly treated by the justice system, Abbott's lack of accountability and empathy alienated many who once sympathized with him. His story does illustrate the complex and often contradictory nature of a man who sought to critique societal flaws, but ultimately failed to confront his own. That concludes the first video of my Murderers A to Z series. I know we aren't meant to be fond of the killers in these stories, but I hope the next name is less obnoxious.